She was 14 years old when ISIS fighters came to her village in northern Iraq. They separated the men from the women, the boys from the girls. Her father and brothers were taken to the edge of town. She heard gunfire. She never saw them again. What followed for her and thousands of other Yazidi women was a nightmare that human rights investigators later called genocide. She survived. And what she witnessed, what was done to her, and how she escaped, is a story of terror that the world tried to look away from, but can no longer ignore. To understand what ISIS did to the people under its control, you have to understand what ISIS actually was. Not the caricature presented in headlines, not the faceless evil that suddenly appeared, but the calculated, organized, and deliberate movement that seized territory, established governance, and implemented a system of control through terror that was unlike anything the modern world had seen. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, emerged from the chaos of the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. Its roots traced back to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but by 2014 it had evolved into something different, something more ambitious and more brutal. On June 29, 2014, ISIS declared the establishment of a caliphate, a religious state governed by their extreme interpretation of Islamic law. Their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared himself caliph, the political and religious leader of all Muslims worldwide. At its peak in 2015, ISIS controlled territory roughly the size of Great Britain, spanning across Syria and Iraq. Over 8 million people lived under their rule. They controlled oil fields, banks, and infrastructure. They collected taxes. They ran courts. They had a functioning bureaucracy. This was not just a terrorist organization. It was a proto-state, and that state ran on fear. The executions that ISIS became infamous for were not random acts of violence. They were systematic, they were public, and they were designed with specific purposes. To terrorize local populations into submission, to eliminate anyone who might resist, to attract foreign fighters who were drawn to the spectacle of violence, and to project power far beyond their physical territory through videos that spread across the internet within hours. Between 2014 and 2017, human rights organizations documented thousands of executions carried out by ISIS. The methods varied: public beheadings in town squares, mass shootings at execution sites, drownings, burnings, people thrown from buildings. The violence was not hidden. It was performed, filmed, edited with high production values, and distributed through social media channels that ISIS operated with shocking sophistication. But behind every video, every propaganda image, every headline about another atrocity, there were real people, families, children, individuals whose lives were destroyed not for what they did, but for who they were. And some of those people survived. Their stories are not easy to hear, but they are essential, because they are the only counter to the propaganda ISIS created. They are the truth that refuses to disappear. August 3, 2014. ISIS fighters swept into the Sinjar region of northern Iraq, home to the Yazidi people, a religious minority that had lived in the area for thousands of years. What happened over the next days and weeks would later be classified by the United Nations as genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Yazidi people in whole or in part. The Yazidis practice an ancient religion that predates Islam and Christianity. ISIS declared them devil worshippers and claimed their existence was an affront that could not be tolerated. The attack on Sinjar was not random. It was planned, and it was total. When ISIS entered Yazidi villages, they separated people by age and gender. Men and older boys, generally anyone over the age of 12, were taken to execution sites. Some were shot in mass graves they had been forced to dig themselves. Human rights investigators later documented at least 80 mass grave sites in the Sinjar region alone. Estimates suggest over 3,000 Yazidi men and boys were executed in the first weeks of the genocide. Women and girls faced a different horror. They were taken as captives. Thousands of them, loaded into trucks and buses and driven to holding facilities in Mosul, Raqqa, and Tel Afar. There they were registered, photographed, and sold. ISIS established an organized system of sexual slavery, governed by written rules distributed to fighters. Price lists were created. Younger girls were worth more. Women were bought, sold, and traded among ISIS fighters like property. Nadia Murad was one of those women. She was 21 years old when ISIS fighters came to her village of Kocho. Her brothers were executed. She was taken with other women to Mosul. She was sold. She was raped repeatedly by multiple men, who quoted religious texts to justify what they were doing to her. She eventually escaped, fleeing through ISIS territory with the help of a family who risked their lives to hide her. She made it to a refugee camp, then to Germany. And then she did something extraordinary. She spoke. In 2016, Nadia Murad testified before the United Nations Security Council. She described in detail what had been done to her and thousands of other Yazidi women. She named ISIS crimes as genocide and sexual slavery. She demanded accountability. In 2018, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Her testimony, and the testimonies of other survivors like her, became the foundation for international legal cases that are still unfolding today. But survival did not mean safety. Thousands of Yazidi women and children remain missing. Some are believed to still be held in captivity. Others are presumed dead. And those who escaped carry trauma that will last the rest of their lives. ISIS did not just kill people. They created a system, a bureaucracy of terror with rules, procedures, and a purpose behind every act of violence. Understanding that system is essential to understanding how they maintained control over millions of people for years. Public executions were held in specific locations at specific times. In Raqqa, the de facto capital of ISIS's so-called caliphate, executions took place in Al-Naim Square, which became known as Hell Square among residents. Crowds were forced to attend. Children were brought by parents who feared that refusing would mark their families as disloyal. The executions were announcements. Teachers who refused to teach ISIS's curriculum, shopkeepers accused of cheating customers, women accused of adultery, men accused of spying. The charges varied, but the message was consistent. This is what happens when you disobey. The Hizbah, ISIS's religious police, enforced rules covering every aspect of daily life. Women had to be fully covered, including gloves and face veils. Men were required to attend prayers. Smoking was banned. Music was banned. Any behavior deemed un-Islamic, according to ISIS's interpretation, was punishable. Punishments ranged from public lashings to amputation to execution, depending on the offense and the whim of whoever was enforcing the rules that day. ISIS also targeted specific groups for elimination. Journalists were hunted systematically. Activists who had opposed the Assad regime in Syria and then opposed ISIS were killed. Members of the Iraqi military and police were executed en masse. In June 2014, ISIS executed an estimated 1,700 Iraqi Air Force cadets in what became known as the Camp Speicher massacre. The cadets were marched to execution sites along the Tigris River and shot. The killings were filmed. ISIS released the videos as propaganda. The same pattern was repeated with Shia Muslims, who ISIS considered apostates, and with Christians and other religious minorities. Entire communities were given ultimatums: convert, pay a religious tax, or die. Thousands chose to flee. Those who could not flee, or who were captured, faced systematic persecution. But ISIS did not only terrorize those within their territory, they exported their violence. Foreign hostages, journalists, aid workers, and others were executed on camera in videos designed for international audiences. These videos were produced with multiple cameras, editing software, and graphic design. They were released through coordinated social media campaigns. The goal was not just to kill. It was to spread fear far beyond the physical borders of the caliphate, to make the world feel ISIS's reach. And it worked. The videos went viral. News organizations debated whether to show them. Social media platforms struggled to remove them fast enough. And ISIS used that attention to recruit foreign fighters from over 80 countries who traveled to Syria and Iraq to join what they believed was a righteous cause. What those recruits found when they arrived was a state built on a foundation of corpses. One of the most important aspects of the fight against ISIS has been documentation. Not the propaganda that ISIS itself produced, but the meticulous, dangerous, and ongoing work of survivors and activists who risked their lives to document what was really happening. In Raqqa, a group of young Syrian activists formed a network called Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. They used hidden cameras, smuggled footage, and anonymous social media accounts to share images and reports of life under ISIS. They documented executions, public punishments, and the daily oppression of civilians. They became one of the most important sources of information for international media, trying to understand what was happening inside ISIS territory. ISIS hunted them. Members of the group were kidnapped and executed. Their families were targeted. In 2015, ISIS released a video showing the execution of one member, a young man who had been documenting their crimes. Despite this, the group continued operating. They believed the world needed to see the truth. That documentation was a form of resistance. Other survivors became witnesses in a different way. Escaped Yazidi women worked with human rights organizations to provide detailed testimony about the sexual slavery system. They described the facilities where they were held, the men who bought them, the locations where transactions took place. This information became evidence. In 2018, the United Nations established the Investigative Team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh/ISIS, known as UNITAD. This team has collected millions of pieces of evidence, including documents, videos, witness testimony, and digital records. They have conducted interviews with thousands of survivors. They have exhumed mass graves and identified victims. Their work has supported criminal prosecutions in multiple countries. One investigator described the process as building a case against a state, because that is what ISIS was, and the evidence had to be strong enough to hold individuals accountable for crimes committed within a functioning system of governance, not just random acts of violence. Survivors have also worked with forensic experts to identify victims from mass graves, DNA samples, personal belongings, dental records. The work is slow and painful. Families wait years to learn whether their loved ones have been found. Some bodies may never be identified. But the effort continues because for many survivors, closure is impossible without knowing what happened to those who disappeared. The documentation process has created an unprecedented archive of genocide and crimes against humanity. An archive that survivors hope will prevent future denial, will ensure that those responsible face justice, and will give families answers. But documentation alone is not justice. When ISIS's caliphate collapsed in March 2019, tens of thousands of ISIS fighters and their families were captured. Many were placed in detention camps in Syria and Iraq. Others escaped. Some blended back into civilian populations, and some fled to other countries, including Europe. The challenge of bringing ISIS members to justice has proven to be one of the most complicated legal and political issues of the past decade. Who has jurisdiction? What evidence is admissible? How do you prosecute someone for crimes committed in a war zone in another country? And what do you do with foreign fighters who have citizenship in countries that may not want them back? Germany has been one of the most active countries in prosecuting ISIS crimes. using the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows countries to prosecute certain international crimes regardless of where they occurred. German courts have tried numerous cases involving ISIS members. Many of these cases have relied on survivor testimony and evidence collected by UNITAD. In 2021, a German court convicted a former ISIS member of genocide and crimes against humanity for his role in the enslavement and murder of a Yazidi girl. The case was brought based on testimony from the girl's mother, who had been enslaved alongside her daughter. The conviction was the first time anyone had been held legally accountable for genocide against the Yazidis. The mother, who testified in court, said the verdict would not bring her daughter back, but that it mattered that the world recognized what had been done. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands have also prosecuted cases. The evidence often includes social media posts, messages, videos that ISIS members themselves posted during their time in Syria and Iraq. The same propaganda they created to glorify their actions has become evidence of their crimes. But the vast majority of ISIS perpetrators have not faced justice. Thousands remain in detention camps in northeastern Syria, held by Kurdish forces who lack the resources and legal framework to prosecute them. Iraq has conducted trials and executions of ISIS members, but human rights organizations have criticized these trials as lacking due process and often relying on confessions obtained under torture. The foreign fighter problem remains unresolved. Many European countries have been reluctant to repatriate their citizens who joined ISIS, particularly women and children. As of 2024, approximately 56,000 people, including 30,000 children, remain in detention camps in Syria under conditions that human rights groups describe as inhumane. And then there are the senior leaders. Some were killed in military operations. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-declared caliph, died in a U.S. military raid in October 2019. His successor was killed in 2022. But many senior figures remain unaccounted for. Some are believed to be hiding in Iraq or Syria. Others may have escaped to other countries. The search continues. Investigators track financial records, digital communications, and witness accounts. Survivors continue to provide testimony, and slowly, perpetrators are being identified, located, and brought to trial. But for survivors, every delay is its own injustice. When ISIS was defeated militarily in 2019, the question for millions of people became, what now? Cities had been destroyed, infrastructure was gone, families were shattered, and the trauma of living under ISIS rule was something no one knew how to process. In Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, the scars of ISIS control and the battle to retake it are still everywhere. Entire neighborhoods remain rubble. Buildings are pockmarked with bullet holes. Unexploded ordnance is still being cleared. But people have returned. They are rebuilding homes with their own hands, reopening shops, trying to restart lives that were violently interrupted. For Yazidi survivors, return has been more complicated. Many fled to camps in the Kurdistan region of Iraq or to other countries entirely. The trauma of what happened in Sinjar makes the idea of returning unbearable for some. Others have returned to find their homes destroyed and their communities gone. The Yazidi population, which numbered around 550,000 before 2014, was devastated. Thousands were killed. Thousands more remain missing, and the community is scattered across multiple countries with no clear path to recovery. Nadia Murad, the Nobel laureate, has established an organization called Nadia's Initiative that works to rebuild Yazidi communities and support survivors. The organization has rebuilt schools, water systems, and homes in Sinjar. But Murad has also been outspoken about the fact that rebuilding infrastructure is not enough. Survivors need mental health support. They need justice. They need the world to continue paying attention even now that ISIS is no longer dominating headlines. Mental health among survivors is a crisis that has received far too little attention. PTSD rates among those who lived under ISIS are extraordinarily high. Depression, anxiety, survivor's guilt. Many survivors describe feeling like they are still waiting for something terrible to happen, that the fear ISIS instilled never fully left. Therapeutic services are scarce. Cultural stigma around mental health in many communities makes it difficult for people to seek help. And the scale of need far exceeds the capacity of the organizations trying to provide support. Children who grew up under ISIS face their own unique challenges. Some were taken from families and placed in ISIS-run schools where they were indoctrinated and, in some cases, trained to fight. Deprogramming and reintegration for these children is complicated. Some communities have rejected them. Some families do not know how to help them. These children carry trauma they did not choose and an association with ISIS they did not create. And then there are the children born of rape. Yazidi women who became pregnant during their captivity faced impossible choices. Some aborted. Some gave birth in captivity. Some gave birth after escaping. Yazidi religious law traditionally does not accept children born of rape into the community. Some women have had to choose between keeping their children and returning to their families. Organizations have worked with religious leaders to try to change these policies, with limited success. Life after ISIS is not a single story. It is thousands of individual struggles to reclaim something that was taken, to heal from wounds that are both visible and invisible, and to live in a world that has largely moved on while they remain trapped in a past they cannot escape. The declaration of ISIS's territorial defeat in March 2019 was celebrated around the world. But for intelligence agencies, military commanders, and people living in Iraq and Syria, it was not the end. It was a transition. ISIS had lost its cities. It had not lost its ideology or all of its fighters. By the end of 2019, ISIS had reverted to what it had been before it seized territory: an insurgency. Fighters melted back into the population or retreated to desert areas. They shifted tactics from holding ground to conducting guerrilla attacks, assassinations of local leaders, kidnappings, roadside bombs, ambushes of military convoys. United Nations reports from 2023 and 2024 estimate that ISIS retains between 5,000 and 7,000 fighters in Iraq and Syria. They operate in cells. They finance themselves through extortion, smuggling, and control of some oil resources. They continue to recruit, and they have proven capable of carrying out attacks that remind the world they still exist. In January 2022, ISIS fighters attacked a prison in northeastern Syria holding thousands of ISIS detainees. The attack lasted for days. Hundreds of ISIS fighters escaped. Kurdish forces eventually regained control, but the attack demonstrated that ISIS retained operational capability and that the detention infrastructure was vulnerable. ISIS has also expanded into other regions. ISIS affiliates operate in Afghanistan, known as ISIS-K, in West Africa, through groups like Boko Haram's ISIS-aligned faction, in the Sahel, in Mozambique, and in the Philippines. These groups have varying degrees of connection to the core ISIS organization, but they use the ISIS brand and its tactics. And they target civilians with the same brutality that ISIS used in Iraq and Syria. The fear among security analysts is that without sustained pressure, ISIS could rebuild. History has shown that extremist groups are resilient. Al-Qaeda was declared defeated multiple times and continued to adapt. The conditions that allowed ISIS to rise in the first place, weak governance, sectarian tensions, economic desperation, still exist in many parts of Iraq and Syria. Survivors watch these developments with deep anxiety. They know what a resurgence would mean. They lived it. And they do not want the world to forget what ISIS is capable of simply because the headlines have moved on. International military presence in the region has decreased. Attention has shifted to other conflicts. Funding for stabilization and reconstruction has declined, and ISIS has noticed. Their propaganda, which never stopped, has increasingly focused on the narrative that they are waiting, rebuilding, preparing for the next phase. Whether that phase ever comes depends on factors far beyond the control of the survivors who have already paid the highest price. The fight for justice and accountability did not end in 2019. In fact, some of the most significant legal and political developments have occurred in the past few years, as survivors, investigators, and governments continue pushing for consequences. In 2023, a landmark trial concluded in Germany. A woman who had traveled from Germany to Syria to join ISIS in 2014 was convicted of crimes against humanity and membership in a terrorist organization. The case was significant because it involved a woman's role in the ISIS system. For years, narratives about ISIS focused primarily on male fighters. But women played essential roles in enforcement, recruitment, and in some cases, direct violence. This trial, and others like it, expanded the scope of accountability. Also in 2023, France began trials of French nationals who had joined ISIS and were repatriated from detention camps in Syria. These trials have been highly publicized and deeply controversial. Some families of victims have attended. Some have testified. The trials have forced France to confront the scale of radicalization that occurred within its borders, and the consequences of citizens who traveled to join a genocidal organization. In Iraq, the Yazidi Survivors Law was passed in 2021, providing reparations and support to survivors of ISIS crimes, particularly Yazidi women and other minorities. The law was a direct result of advocacy by survivors like Nadia Murad. Implementation has been slow, and many eligible survivors have not yet received support. But the law represents formal recognition by the Iraqi government of what happened. UNITAD, the UN Investigative Team, continues its work. In 2024, they announced they had collected over 18 million digital records related to ISIS crimes. This includes internal ISIS documents, videos, social media posts, and communications. The evidence is being shared with national authorities to support prosecutions. UNITAD has also worked to preserve mass grave sites and ensure that evidence is collected in a way that meets international legal standards. There has also been growing attention to the children who were part of ISIS families. Thousands of children born or raised under ISIS remain in camps, stateless and uncertain of their futures. Some countries have begun repatriating children separately from their parents. Others have refused. The question of what responsibility societies have to these children and how to prevent them from becoming the next generation of extremists remains unresolved. In 2024, a new documentary featuring testimony from Yazidi survivors and footage of mass grave exhumations was released, bringing renewed attention to the genocide. The film, which included interviews with survivors who had never spoken publicly before, was screened at the United Nations and received widespread attention. Survivors hope it will maintain pressure on governments to continue accountability efforts. But for all the progress, enormous gaps remain. The vast majority of ISIS fighters have never been prosecuted. Thousands of victims have never been identified. Families are still searching for missing loved ones. And the structural issues that allowed ISIS to rise have not been fully addressed. Survivors continue speaking, testifying, and demanding that the world not look away, because they know that silence is what allows atrocity to happen again. She was 14 years old when ISIS came to her village. She hid. She survived. She lost her father and brothers. She was enslaved. She escaped. And then she spoke. That is how this story began. And it is important to return to her now, because her story, and the stories of thousands like her, did not end when ISIS's caliphate fell. She is in her 20s now. She lives in a different country. She has learned a new language. She has testified in court. She has shared her story with journalists, with human rights organizations, with anyone who would listen. She has done everything a survivor can do to ensure that what happened to her is documented, acknowledged, and not forgotten. But she still has nightmares. She still carries the weight of what she saw and what was done to her. She still thinks about the people who did not make it out, and she still waits for the day when every single person responsible is held accountable. What survivors like her ask of the world is not complicated. They ask for justice. Real justice, not symbolic gestures. They ask for the missing to be found and identified. They ask for reparations that actually reach the people who need them. They ask for mental health support. They ask for the truth to be taught so that future generations understand what happened and why it must never happen again. And they ask that the world not look away simply because ISIS is no longer holding cities. Because the threat is not gone. The ideology is not gone. And the conditions that allowed ISIS to rise are still present in multiple countries across the world. The survivors of ISIS's brutality gave the world something invaluable. They gave testimony. They provided evidence. They forced the international community to confront crimes that were designed to be too horrific to look at directly. They refused to be silenced by trauma. They turned their pain into advocacy. What the world does with that gift will determine whether their suffering leads to change, or whether history repeats itself in a different place, with a different name, but the same pattern. She survived. 800,000 others did not. And the question that remains is not just whether we remember them, it is whether we act on what their stories demand of us: justice, accountability, and the courage to confront evil before it takes root again. The cameras that ISIS used to spread fear are off now, but the survivors are still speaking. The question is whether anyone is still listening.